There's a particular kind of silence that fills a courtroom before the judge enters. I've read about it in case studies, analyzed it in law journals during my work as a sustainable wealth manager, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepares you for how it sounds when that silence is about your life, about your family, about the man sitting 3 rows in front of me who happens to share my last name, but not much else. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 30 years old. I manage wealth that's supposed to last longer than the people who earned it, which I've always found beautifully ironic, because in my family, what lasts isn't money, it's resentment. It's carefully wrapped abandonment tied with legal ribbons. It's the kind of silence that echoes for decades. The fluorescent lights hum overhead. They're the harsh kind that make everyone look slightly diseased, slightly guilty. The courtroom smells like ebony wood, old paper, and something metallic that might be bureaucracy's actual scent if such a thing existed. There's also the faint smell of the green ink from the sealed envelope sitting on the evidence table. Green ink. Who writes with green ink anymore? My grandfather, Edward Hale, did. Exclusively. He believed that black ink was too harsh, too final, too bound to anger. Green ink, he used to tell me, carried memory the way leaves carry the memory of spring. I was 7 when he told me that. I've remembered it for 23 years. The security guard whispers something into his radio. Somewhere down the hallway, I can hear the muffled sound of news cameras being set up. This case has become exactly what my grandfather never wanted it to become: a spectacle, a public reckoning, a family autopsy performed in front of strangers. Thomas Brooks, my father, walks past without making eye contact. He wears a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he's already acquired that specific politician's expression, the one that says, "I'm deeply concerned about this travesty," while every muscle in his face is carefully arranged to communicate dignity, wounded by injustice. He's been perfecting that expression for 30 years. Judge Carter Sloan enters through the side door. He's 60 years old, with the kind of face that suggests he's spent his entire career making difficult decisions with the confidence of someone who's never had to live with their consequences. I know something about him that most people in this courtroom don't know yet. I know that he and Thomas have been friends since their first year at law school. I have photographs. I have receipts. I have 15 years of gala attendance lists, charity committee memberships, and shared business ventures documented across my apartment kitchen table like some kind of obsessive conspiracy board. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Peter Vaughn, my attorney, leans toward me and whispers, "Breathe. You've done this before." Except I haven't. Not like this. I've argued cases before, certainly. I've sat across conference tables from wealth management disputes, written arguments about portfolio allocation, faced off against people trying to prove that elderly clients had lost mental capacity when really those elderly clients just didn't want to give their money to ungrateful children. But I've never sat on this side of the table. I've never had my own grief turned into a legal question mark. Thomas stands up, and his voice fills the courtroom with the kind of righteous anger that only comes from having trained it daily before a mirror. "Your Honor, this is an absolute travesty. My daughter has twisted my father-in-law's deteriorating mental state into an opportunity for personal gain. She has destroyed this family's legacy, and frankly, she has brought profound dishonor upon the Brooks name." Judge Sloan's gavel comes down, once, sharp and metallic. I feel Peter tense beside me. My hands, which I've practiced keeping steady through meditation and breathing exercises and pure, stubborn determination, suddenly feel very small. I look directly at my father. Not with anger. I've learned that anger is just fear wearing an aggressive costume. I look at him with clarity, and I say, very quietly, "I've known about this game for a long time." The bailiff shifts uncomfortably. Someone in the gallery gasps. Probably a reporter. They love moments like this. family drama with legal documentation. It's better than television. But the truth, the real truth, the kind that lives in green ink and sealed envelopes and old photographs, the truth is far more complicated than anyone here wants it to be. Let me explain how I got here. Let me explain what this is really about. I was born 30 years ago to a woman named Catherine Brooks. Catherine was Edward Hale's daughter, my grandfather's only child. She was remarkable, from what the people who knew her have told me. Smart, kind, the kind of person who apparently inspired loyalty in people just by being honest with them. I wouldn't know this from personal experience because Catherine died when I was 3 days old. Postpartum complications. One moment, she existed. The next moment, she didn't. Thomas Brooks, my father, made the decision that having a newborn daughter and a dead wife was too much of an obstacle to his ambitions. He was a junior lawyer then, with political aspirations that looked like a career trajectory written in bold letters. He looked at a crying infant. That was me. And he looked at the practical requirements of single fatherhood. And he made a choice. He left. Not immediately. He left gradually, in the way that men leave when they believe their absence is temporary. He stayed with my grandparents for 6 months. He left work early. And then he left earlier. And then he stopped showing up. He moved out. He said he needed space. He said it was just temporary. He said, and I found this recorded in my grandmother's diary, I just need to figure out who I am without her. Without her. Without my mother. Without me. My grandparents, Edward and Marjorie Hale, looked at their dead daughter and their grieving son-in-law making a strategic exit, and they made their own choice. They kept me. They raised me. They chose me in a way that Thomas never did. My grandmother, Marjorie, developed Alzheimer's when I was in high school. She's been dead for 4 years now, but I still have her care journals. 17 years of meticulous, heartbreaking documentation of her own mind disappearing. She wrote about her medications. She wrote about her good days and her bad days. She wrote about me. One entry, dated 14 years ago, just reads, Natalie read me the original will today. My hands didn't shake. That was important enough that she wrote it down. That was important enough to document in the slowly disintegrating landscape of her memory. My grandfather, Edward, was different. Where Thomas was absent, Edward was present. Where Thomas was ambitious, Edward was thoughtful. He built a company that manufactures sustainable materials, the kind of business that doesn't just make money, but makes money while also giving a damn about whether the planet survives. He built that company, and he built it deliberately, and he built it in a way that allowed him to spend time with me. He taught me that money was a tool, not a master. That tools could be used badly or well, but the responsibility for how you used them never left your hands. When Edward got older, and when Marjorie's Alzheimer's began its terrible, incremental theft, Edward asked me to take a year off work. He asked me to come home. He asked me to help him take care of the woman he'd loved for 42 years, while that woman's mind slowly became a stranger's mind. I did it. I signed the paperwork to take an unpaid leave of absence from my firm. I moved into the house where I grew up, and I became a caregiver. Not reluctantly, not bitterly, but actually. I changed my grandmother's clothes. I bathed her. I read her favorite books to her. I sorted through the medications and the medical appointments and all the 1,000 small catastrophes that come with advanced dementia. I did this for 2 years. My father did not visit during this time. Not once. Not for a holiday. Not for an emergency. Not for anything. He was, I would later learn from his increasingly aggressive attempts to control the narrative, busy building his political career. He was running for state senate. He was making important connections. He was, in his words during his testimony that I'll get to in a moment, making a life for himself. When Thomas was finally notified that Edward was dying, that my grandfather, the man who had raised me, the man who had become my primary parent in every way that mattered, was approaching the end, he did send flowers. Yellow roses, no card. Just a delivery confirmation with his name printed on it. Edward died on a Tuesday morning in April. I was holding his hand. His will was precisely what you might expect from a man who had lived deliberately and thoughtfully. He left specific bequests to his employees. He established a scholarship fund. He created trusts for medical research. He left money to the organizations that had helped care for my grandmother during her decline, and he left his entire personal estate, the house, the investments, the collection of first edition books, and approximately $48 million to me. But there was a condition. There's always a condition in the wills of thoughtful people. The condition was what they call conditional bequest of loyalty. Essentially, it meant that I would inherit the full estate only if I could prove that I had remained loyal to the Hale family values, that I had not used my position as his caregiver to manipulate or influence him, that I could provide documentation, medical evaluations, witness testimony, the complete care journals, proving that his decisions were made from a clear and uncompromised mind. It should have been straightforward. The documentation was extensive. The witnesses were unimpeachable. The medical records were crystal clear, except that Thomas looked at these provisions and saw an opportunity rather than a legacy. He saw $48 million being held in the kind of legal limbo that he believed he could exploit. And so, 3 months after Edward's funeral, he filed a petition challenging the will. He argued that I had undue influence over my grandfather. He argued that I had manipulated an elderly man's affections for personal profit. He argued that my extended caregiving had actually been a calculated strategy to become my grandfather's sole beneficiary. He made these arguments in a legal brief that was filed directly to Judge Carter Sloane's courtroom, and Judge Sloane, who had been Thomas's friend and colleague for nearly 40 years, accepted the case. The sealed envelope on the evidence table contains a letter. Edward wrote it 2 months before he died. He wrote it knowing that Thomas might do exactly what he did, and he wrote it in green ink. The letter reads, "Thomas, you inherit my silence. I have chosen my daughter for a reason you still don't understand. She chose to stay." That's all it says. 12 words. 12 words written in green ink. 12 words that are about to determine whether I keep my grandfather's entire legacy or whether a judge who plays golf with my father decides that Thomas deserves $48 million as compensation for the daughter he abandoned. I watched Judge Sloane shuffle some papers. I watched Thomas cross his arms over his chest. I watch Peter place his hand on my folder of evidence and look directly at me with an expression that says, "We're about to find out if the legal system works the way we've all been told it does." And I sit with the weight of it, the weight of 3 generations, my grandfather who stayed, my grandmother who documented her own disappearance with heroic precision, my mother who died before I knew her name, my father who chose a career over fatherhood, and me caught in the middle of a courtroom that smells like ebony and lies. The judge looks at Thomas. The judge looks at me. The judge looks at the green ink envelope. And then he asks the first question, the one that will determine everything. "Counsel, how do you propose to prove mental competency?" This is where the real fight begins. This is where we find out whether truth actually means anything in a world built by people with power and connections and decades of friendship to protect. The headlines came before we finished the first day of testimony. I watched them accumulate on my phone like some kind of algorithmic catastrophe. Granddaughter contests, senator's father's will. Multi-million-dollar estate dispute tears family apart. Brooks' family wealth at center of shocking court case. And my personal favorite? Dutiful daughter or calculated manipulator, the Natalie Brooks question. The Natalie Brooks question, as if I was a mathematical problem that could be solved by having enough people debate the answer. As if my character, my intentions, my entire existence could be reduced to a question mark hanging in the space between what people wanted to believe and what was actually true. By day 2 of the trial, the courthouse steps had become a genuine media spectacle. Not the kind that courthouses usually see, not reporters quietly taking notes and behaving professionally. This was different. This was the kind of media presence that suggests someone had been very deliberate about timing, about message, about narrative construction. Thomas's publicist, and yes, a state senator has a publicist, had been busy. Very busy. The spin was genius, I'll admit. Absolutely genius from a strategic perspective. The narrative was this. A successful, ambitious state senator's elderly father-in-law had been influenced by his youngest caregiver grandchild into cutting off the natural heir, the man's own son, from the family fortune. The caregiver, it was suggested, had isolated the old man, become his only support system, and then used that isolation to convince him that the senator was somehow unworthy of his inheritance. It was the kind of story that made people angry. It made them feel righteous about their anger. It was the kind of story designed to make strangers care about a family they'd never heard of before this week. The problem with the spin, of course, was that it wasn't actually true. But truth, I was learning, moved at a much slower pace than narrative. Truth required documentation and time and careful explanation. Narrative required only emotion and repetition. My attorney, Peter Vaughn, is the kind of lawyer who thrives in moments like this. He's 42, with the kind of calm that comes from having spent 2 decades in courtrooms watching people's lives be decided by the careful presentation of evidence. He's been called shark-like by his opponents, but I think that's imprecise. Sharks are driven by instinct and hunger. Peter is driven by something more fundamental, an absolute belief that facts matter, and that if you arrange facts correctly, the truth will emerge regardless of the noise around it. On the morning of day 2, Peter and I met in the law library adjacent to the courthouse. I'd spent the previous evening reading every headline, every speculation, every comment thread where strangers were making judgments about my family, my character, and my father's supposed victimhood. I hadn't slept. "Stop reading," Peter said, not looking up from the stack of medical records he was organizing. "The media narrative doesn't matter. What matters is what we can prove." "The media narrative is what decides whether people think I'm a monster," I said. "I don't think people get to decide that about us anymore," Peter replied. "The judge decides. The law decides. Everyone else is just noise." But he was only partly right. Everyone else isn't just noise. Everyone else is the context in which the judge makes his decisions. Everyone else is the cultural pressure that shapes what a judge is willing to believe. Everyone else is, in a very real sense, part of the verdict. We spent that entire day assembling the evidence platform. That was Peter's term for it. The platform of evidence. Because he believed that you had to build something solid enough to stand on while presenting the truth. You couldn't just throw facts at a judge and hope they'd stick. You had to construct an argument. You had to create a narrative that was more compelling than the narrative people had already heard on the news. The evidence platform consisted of several layers. First layer, Dr. Allison Reed, my grandfather's physician for the past 15 years. She was a small woman in her mid-50s with the kind of competence that came from having made thousands of medical decisions and lived to defend all of them. She had examined Edward multiple times in the weeks before his death. She had evaluated his cognitive function specifically, looking for signs of dementia, of medication-induced confusion, of any medical reason to believe he wasn't making his own decisions. Your grandfather was sharp, she told me. Not before testifying, but a few days before, during a prep session. Genuinely sharp. His memory was perfect. His reasoning was clear. He had cancer, yes, but it wasn't affecting his brain. When I saw him 2 weeks before he died, I noted in his file, patient mentally competent, decisions are clearly his own. She would testify to this. The judge would hear her say this. And it would matter. Or it wouldn't. Depending on whether he wanted it to matter. Second layer. My grandmother's care journals. 17 years of Marjorie's careful documentation of her own cognitive decline. But more importantly, and this is what made them so powerful as evidence, the journals from the period when she was still competent enough to write about her son. They showed that Marjorie had been aware that Thomas wasn't coming home. She had documented her own pain about this. And then she had documented something else. Her realization that I was actually there. That I was the one who showed up. One entry, from 10 years before she died, before her Alzheimer's had progressed past the point where she could still write coherently, read. Thomas called, said he couldn't make the holiday, said something about a legislative session. Natalie made Christmas dinner. We had it at 5 in the afternoon so Edward could rest. She wore her mother's ring. I noticed Edward notice. I had read this entry 1,000 times, more than 1,000. The idea that my grandmother had understood what was happening, that she had recognized the choice between the child who came and the child who didn't. The idea that she had been aware enough to document this understanding, even as her mind was beginning its terrible retreat. It was both heartbreaking and clarifying. Third layer, the actual medical records. Cognitive assessments, psychological evaluations, a whole documentary record of Edward's mental and physical state in the weeks and months leading up to his death. It was boring, in the way that evidence often is. It was specific and technical, and didn't tell a story so much as it told a collection of numbers, test results, and clinical observations. But those boring, technical documents were the foundation of everything. They were the bedrock on which the truth was supposed to be built. Fourth layer, and this was the one that brought everything into focus, was the testimony of Ruth Miller. Ruth had been the Hale family's housekeeper for the past 20 years. She wasn't educated in the way that lawyers are educated. She couldn't testify about legal concepts. But she had been there. She had watched the family change. She had seen who came home and who didn't. She had brought Edward his breakfast every morning for 2 decades, and she had heard him talk about his children and his granddaughter. Natalie came home, Ruth would testify. Mr. Brooks didn't. That's just the facts of it. Everyone knows when someone stops coming home. The house knows. The rooms know. The person who cooks knows it best of all, because you're making breakfast for the same number of people every morning. It was simple. It was powerful. It was the kind of truth that didn't need legal language because it was already speaking in the language of observation and presence and absence. But we also needed to address what Peter called the narrative counterclaim. In other words, we needed to directly address the accusation that I had undue influence over my grandfather. We needed to prove that Edward had made his decisions freely, with full knowledge of what he was doing, and with full understanding of what it meant to exclude Thomas. To do this, we had to be willing to present evidence that made the case harder to explain, not easier. We had to present evidence that Edward had been aware of the legal challenge that was coming. We had to show that he had anticipated Thomas's response. And most damaging of all, we had to show that Edward had basically told Thomas, in that sealed envelope with the green ink, exactly what he was doing and why. Peter walked me through the strategy during our morning briefing. The judge will ask, he said, whether Edward expected Thomas to contest this will. The answer is yes. Edward absolutely expected it. He references it in his letter. He writes, "I have chosen my daughter for a reason you still don't understand." He's acknowledging that Thomas won't understand. He's predicting that Thomas will fight the decision, and he's making that decision anyway. That's going to make it look like grandfather was angry, I said. Yes, Peter agreed. And that's our advantage. Because angry is not the same as incompetent. Angry is not the same as cognitively impaired. Angry is a perfectly reasonable response to a situation that deserves anger. Edward had a son who abandoned him. He had a granddaughter who stayed. He was allowed to be angry about that. And he was allowed to make a financial decision based on that anger. The law doesn't require that you leave your money to people you're angry with. But there was another dimension to the evidence platform, and this was the part that made me deeply uncomfortable. It was the part where we had to address something that nobody wanted to acknowledge directly, but which existed in the background of every single conversation about this case. Thomas was broke. Not in the way that normal people are broke. Thomas had a comfortable income as a state senator. He had political connections and business opportunities. But he had also made some very specific financial decisions that had left him vulnerable. He had invested in his first campaign at a level that required repayment. He had involved himself in business ventures that didn't work out. He had maintained a lifestyle that exceeded his actual wealth accumulation. And somewhere, in the space between his ambitions and his actual assets, he had apparently decided that his father-in-law's $48 million was available for the taking. Peter had uncovered this through basic financial research, court records, real estate filings, campaign finance disclosures, public information, all of it. Information that painted a portrait of a man who had been living on the edge of financial crisis for years. Information that suggested that contesting the will wasn't primarily about principle, it was about access to capital. "We don't lead with this," Peter told me. "This is our backup ammunition. We use it only if the judge starts looking like he's actually considering Thomas's claims. But it's there. It's real. It's documented. And if we need to show that Thomas had a financial motive for this lawsuit, we have it." I watched the media coverage intensify over the next few days. Someone, and I assumed it was someone working for Thomas, had leaked photographs of me attending events with my grandfather. Me at his office. Me at charity galas. Me looking like what I actually was. A woman who had chosen to be present in her grandfather's life. But the photographs were presented with captions that transformed them into evidence of something sinister. "Natalie controls the patriarch. Isolated heir fights back against manipulative granddaughter. The woman who convinced a billionaire to abandon his son." The language was designed to work on a specific level. It played on cultural narratives about ambitious women and controlling daughters. It played on the archetype of the younger woman who uses her physical proximity to an older man to gain power. It was repulsive, but it was also strategically perfect if your goal was to make people distrust me without ever having to prove anything. I called my therapist, because yes, people who are fighting for their family inheritance and their family reputation need therapy, and I asked her how to deal with the poison of public judgment. "You can't," she said. "You can only control what you know to be true about yourself. The rest of it belongs to other people. And worrying about their opinions is just another way of letting other people control you." "That's not very helpful," I said. "No," she agreed, "but it's accurate." By day 3 of testimony, Peter was ready to begin the counterattack. We had assembled the evidence platform. We had walked through the testimony that would be presented. We had answered the question of whether Edward had been mentally competent. Now we had to answer the harder question. Why would a reasonable person exclude their own son from their entire estate? The answer, we would argue, came down to presence and absence. It came down to choice. It came down to the fact that Thomas Brooks had been absent for the final decade of his father-in-law's life, and when that absence was no longer possible to ignore or rationalize, he had responded by trying to take money. Ruth Miller testified on day 4. She wore her church clothes, a dark blue dress and a small pearl necklace. Her hands shook slightly as she placed her hand on the Bible. The bailiff asked her to swear to tell the truth. "I do," she said. And then she told the truth. She described the rhythms of the Hale household. She described how certain rooms went unused because certain family members never came home. She described the holidays where Natalie cooked and Thomas called. She described standing in the kitchen on Christmas morning 2 years ago, listening to Edward talk about how his son, my father, had missed the past 7 Christmas mornings. "Did Mr. Edward ever express anger about this?" Peter asked. "Oh, yes," Ruth said. "But it wasn't mean anger. It was sad anger. The kind where he understood what he was saying, but he felt sad saying it." Thomas's lawyer cross-examined her, trying to suggest that Ruth was biased, that she had a personal relationship with me, that she couldn't possibly be objective about the situation. But Ruth kept giving the same answer. "I'm just telling you what I saw. What I saw was Mr. Edward loving his granddaughter and his son not coming home." By the end of the day, something had shifted in the courtroom. The judge's expression hadn't changed. He still looked neutral, still looked like a man who was carefully considering all sides. But I could see something in his body language that hadn't been there before. I could see that he was starting to understand that this wasn't a case about an ambitious woman manipulating an old man. This was a case about a father who had abandoned his family being rejected in return, and that is a completely different story. The evidence that finally proved Judge Sloane's bias came to light on day 5 of testimony, but it wasn't something that Peter and I had uncovered through traditional legal research. It came from Ruth. Ruth came to us during the lunch break on day 4, pulling Peter and me aside in the courthouse hallway while reporters swarmed around like hungry animals. She told us something she'd remembered. Her daughter worked in Judge Sloane's chambers. "Nothing big," Ruth said, "just administrative stuff. But she mentioned something last week about a golf trip. Said the judge was planning to go golfing with some friends after the trial was finished. Said one of those friends was probably going to be coming to the courthouse." Peter's face changed. "Who was the friend?" "Your boss," Ruth said, looking at me. "Your father. They go golfing." It was a small thing, a golf trip. Something that appeared in the category of normal social interaction between people who happen to know each other. But it was also, if we could properly document it, evidence that the judge had a pre-existing relationship with one party to the case that went far beyond casual professional acquaintance. Peter immediately requested access to the judge's calendar. It took 2 hours of legal maneuvering, but the court clerk, a woman who had worked in that courthouse for 15 years and had apparently developed some skepticism about the appearance of impartiality, provided the information. Judge Sloane had a notation in his calendar for 3 weeks after the trial was supposed to conclude. It said, "Golfing with Thomas Brooks and Associates." "This is it," Peter said, not to me, but to the air around me, to the universe, to whatever force watches over these things. This is what we needed. But Peter also understood something important. We couldn't just walk into the courtroom and announce that we'd found evidence of bias. That would look vindictive. That would look like we were attacking the judge personally, rather than defending the integrity of the judicial process. We needed a strategy. We needed evidence that was so clear that it basically compelled the judge to recuse himself. So Peter did what good lawyers do. He started photographing. He hired a private investigator, which I paid for, and which felt deeply wrong in ways I didn't have time to process. And that investigator spent the next 3 days following Thomas Brooks and Judge Sloane. The investigator documented a charity gala where both men were in attendance. The investigator documented them standing together at a philanthropic event. The investigator documented committee meetings where both men participated. More than anything, the investigator documented the body language, the way they stood near each other, the way they looked at each other. The way they talked to each other like men who had spent 40 years becoming comfortable in each other's presence. It was all legal. It was all public. It was all the kind of information that anyone with a camera and a willingness to stand in parking lots could obtain. But when it was compiled together, when it was presented as a collection, when it was framed in the specific way that Peter knew how to frame things, it told a story that no one could deny. The story was, these two men are friends. These two men maintain an ongoing social relationship. And one of these men is judging a case that will determine whether the other man gets access to $48 million. The judge's instructions to the witness stand were becoming increasingly tense as the trial progressed. Dr. Allison Reed testified on day 5. She was excellent. She described Edward's mental state in clear, technical, completely unambiguous terms. She said that 2 weeks before his death, Edward had scored in the 98th percentile for cognitive function for his age. She said that his decision-making capacity was unimpaired. She said that she had documented that he was competent to make his own financial decisions and that he had been doing so with full understanding of the consequences. Thomas's lawyer tried to argue that cancer had affected his thinking. Dr. Reed politely but firmly explained that Edward's cancer had not metastasized to his brain. She explained that terminal diagnosis, while certainly emotionally challenging, did not constitute legal incompetency. She explained that many people who are dying make financial decisions, and those decisions are binding and legal. So you're saying, Thomas's lawyer pressed, that even though my client's father-in-law was dying, even though he was in pain, even though he was on significant medications, he was still competent to make decisions that would affect the family for decades to come? I'm saying that yes, Dr. Reed said. And I'm saying that the law is clear on this point. Being terminally ill is not the same as being incompetent. If that were the law, no dying person would be able to make a will at all, and the law specifically rejects that interpretation. I could see the moment Thomas realized the testimony wasn't going the direction he'd hoped. His jaw tightened. His fingers drummed on the table in front of him. The politician's smile flickered slightly and then was carefully reconstructed. What happened next was subtle. If you weren't looking for it, you would have missed it. Ruth was called back to the stand for additional questioning. She was describing the morning of the day Edward died. She described making his coffee. She described Edward being alert and clear and making plans for the day even though his body was shutting down. She described something small but significant. Edward asking her to remind me to read the will to my grandmother one more time. He said that? The judge asked, leaning forward. Yes, sir, Ruth said. He said, Ruth, remind Natalie to read me the will again. My wife should hear it from her voice. And then Natalie will know I meant what I wrote. I watched my father's face. I watched the specific moment when he understood what Edward had done. My grandfather hadn't died in confusion or uncertainty. He had died with absolute clarity about what his will meant and why he had written it that way. He had planned for Thomas to contest it. He had anticipated every argument, and he had made the choice to let my father come to the courtroom and prove everything that Edward had already figured out about him. Thomas blinked. That was all. Just a small, involuntary blink. But in that blink, I could see something like recognition. Like the moment when you understand that someone you know has known you better than you've known yourself all along. And then his face rearranged itself back into the expression of wounded righteousness that he'd been maintaining throughout the trial. But it was fractured now. The mask was cracking. We broke for lunch. Peter pulled me aside and told me what he was planning to do on the afternoon of day 5. He was going to file a motion to recuse. He was going to present all of the photographs. He was going to present the calendar notation. He was going to present the evidence of the golf trip and the gala attendance and every single documented occasion when Thomas and Judge Sloan had interacted outside of the courtroom. It's a risk, Peter told me. Judges don't like being accused of bias. They take it as a personal attack. Sloane could deny everything and rule against us out of spite. What's the alternative? I asked. We lose, Peter said. If Sloane stays on the case, and if he rules for Thomas, we've lost everything. Not just the money, the precedent, the idea that judges are supposed to be impartial. All of it. So we have to do this, I said. Ooh, we have to do this, Peter agreed. The afternoon session began with Peter standing up and making his statement. He was calm. He was careful. He presented the evidence in a way that didn't attack the judge personally, but that made it impossible for the judge to argue that there was no appearance of impropriety. Your Honor, Peter said, I am filing a motion to recuse based on evidence that a substantial and reasonable person might conclude that the court has a pre-existing bias in this matter. I am presenting documentation of multiple social interactions between the defendant's counsel and the presiding judge. I am presenting evidence that the defendant and the judge have planned social events together that are scheduled to occur immediately after this trial's conclusion. And I am presenting evidence that while these interactions are individually legal and appropriate, when combined, they create a situation where the appearance of impartiality is compromised. He laid the photographs on the desk. He showed the calendar notation. He walked through the sequence of events with the precision of someone who has seen 100 trials and knows exactly how to frame evidence so that judges can't dismiss it. Thomas stood up to object, but Peter cut him off. Your Honor, Peter continued, this isn't about questioning your integrity as a jurist. It's about maintaining the integrity of the judicial system. If my client loses this case, she will lose not just the material matter in question, but also the right to appeal based on apparent bias, because the appeal will reference the appearance of impropriety. That means she will be left with a verdict that she cannot adequately challenge because the judge's impartiality is at issue. For the credibility of this court and the credibility of the legal system, I believe you need to recuse yourself. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Judge Sloane's face had changed. The neutral expression was gone. He looked angry. More than angry. He looked betrayed. As if he couldn't believe that his friendship with Thomas was being dragged into the courtroom and examined like a suspicious stain. He looked down at the photographs. He looked at the calendar notation. He looked at Peter. This is highly irregular, the judge said. Yes, Your Honor, Peter agreed. The situation is irregular. The appearance of impropriety is irregular. But the law requires that we maintain the appearance of impartiality, and I believe that you know that. For a long moment, nothing happened. The judge sat at his bench. The bailiff didn't move. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keyboard. And then, Thomas did something that I didn't expect. He stood up, and he said, Your Honor, I am withdrawing my objection to counsel's motion. The entire courtroom shifted. Peter looked at me. I looked at Thomas. Counsel, the judge said, are you telling me that you are consenting to this recusal? I am, Thomas said, and for the first time in the entire trial, his expression was no longer calculated. It looked like actual defeat. I believe my friend the judge needs to recuse himself to maintain the integrity of this process, even if it hurts my case. It was a tactical genius move. By consenting to the recusal, Thomas was making it look like he was taking the high road. He was making it look like he was the one defending the integrity of the system. But he was also ensuring that if he lost, he could blame the recusal rather than his own bad facts. Judge Sloane stood up. For a moment, I thought he was going to announce his recusal, but instead, he said something unexpected. I'm going to take a recess, he announced. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes with a substitute judge. He left the bench. His chamber door closed. Peter looked at me and said quietly, That just happened. We spent the next 30 minutes in a consultation room trying to figure out what this meant. Peter believed that Sloane's anger at being accused of bias suggested that he was going to rule against Thomas. Angry judges sometimes decided that the best way to prove they weren't biased was to rule against the party they were friendly with. A new judge arrived, Judge Helena Vasquez, a woman in her early 60s who had built her career on carefully reading case law and following precedent exactly. She reviewed the trial transcript from the previous days. She read the evidence. She read the motions. And then she made a decision. I will consider the motion to recuse moot, given that Judge Sloane has agreed to step aside, Judge Vasquez announced. As for the substance of the case, I have reviewed the evidence presented so far, and I find it to be quite clear. The evidence demonstrates that the deceased was mentally competent at the time he created his will. The evidence demonstrates that he anticipated this legal challenge. The evidence demonstrates that he made his decisions freely and with full understanding of their consequences. The evidence demonstrates that there is a clear and legal basis for his decision to exclude the challenger from his estate. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of the petitioner on all counts. The will stands as written. She banged her gavel once, and just like that, it was over. The trial that had consumed 5 days, that had become a public spectacle, that had turned my family into a subject of national conversation, it was over. I had won, but winning didn't feel the way I'd expected it to feel. I looked at my father. He was staring at the judge in an expression of utter disbelief, as if the entire legal system had personally betrayed him, and maybe from his perspective, it had. He had come into this trial with the confidence of a man who had built an entire political career on the assumption that the system worked for people like him. And now he had discovered that sometimes the system actually worked for the people with better evidence. Peter put his hand on my shoulder, and I felt my whole body begin to shake. The aftermath of Judge Sloane's recusal was not quiet. The media, which had been hungry for drama during the trial, became absolutely ravenous once the trial was decided. The angle shifted almost immediately. If the story had been ambitious granddaughter fights for inheritance, it was now judge found to have inappropriate relationship with senator in high-stakes trial. Judge Sloane was not happy. By late that evening, after the trial had concluded, and I had been officially informed that the inheritance was legally mine, Sloane released a statement to the press. It was careful, measured, and incredibly angry. He said that he had stepped aside to maintain the integrity of the judicial process, but that he wanted to be clear that the evidence of bias presented by the defense was circumstantial at best and malicious at worst. He said that his relationship with Thomas Brooks was the kind of collegial friendship that existed between many judges and attorneys, and was not, in any way, evidence of improper judicial influence. But the damage was done. The appearance of impropriety had been created, and no amount of statement-making could undo that. Within 48 hours, there were calls from legal ethics organizations requesting a formal investigation into the nature of Sloane's relationship with Thomas. There were suggestions that Sloane might need to recuse himself from other cases involving either Thomas or his associates. The story had transformed. It was no longer about me fighting for my inheritance. It was now about potential corruption in the judicial system, about the ways that friendship and professional relationships could compromise impartiality, about the crisis of confidence in the courts. Thomas, meanwhile, was having his own reckoning. A reporter contacted me, not for an interview, but to give me a heads up about something she'd discovered. She told me that there were questions being asked about the source of Thomas's funding for this legal challenge. Campaign finance records showed contributions from entities that appeared to exist primarily on paper. Charitable donations from foundations that had no clear charitable mission. It looked less like a father fighting for principle and more like a politician using legal proceedings to launder money. I'm not going to write about it, the reporter told me, because I can't prove it. But I wanted you to know that people are looking, and other people will start looking too. Within a week, it was no longer just that Thomas had lost a case. It was that Thomas had potentially engaged in financial misconduct to pursue that case. It was that Thomas's judgment was being questioned on multiple fronts. It was that the carefully maintained image of the successful state senator was beginning to crack, with the same inevitability that the judge's mask had cracked when he understood what had happened. The State Ethics Committee opened an investigation. A nonprofit advocacy group that tracked political finance filed complaints with the Federal Election Commission. The local prosecutor's office began what they called a preliminary inquiry into whether campaign funds had been improperly used to finance a private legal dispute. I watched this unfold with an emotion I hadn't expected to feel: pity. My father had come into this trial with all the advantages. He had been friends with the judge. He had the resources to hire expensive lawyers. He had the media narrative that he wanted to have. And he had lost anyway because the truth, documented, testified to, verified by professionals, had been stronger than all of those advantages combined. And now, instead of accepting that loss with grace, he was being pulled into a series of additional investigations based on the ways he had tried to manipulate the system to avoid that loss. Peter warned me not to talk to Thomas. He said it was better if there was complete separation, no communication, no possibility of reconciliation that might complicate the legal landscape. "He's your father," Peter said, "but right now he's also a hostile party. You need to treat him that way." But I didn't treat him that way, because on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the trial ended, Thomas called me. I almost didn't answer. I saw his name on my phone's caller ID, and every instinct I had told me to let it go to voicemail. But some part of me, some part that was still, despite everything, his daughter, made me answer. "Natalie," he said. His voice was different, smaller, less practiced. "Hello," I said. "I'm stepping down," he told me, "from my campaign. I'm ending my run for re-election." I didn't say anything. "I'm doing it tomorrow," he continued. "I'm holding a press conference. I'm citing family reasons. I'm stepping away from public service." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you deserve to know before the rest of the world knows," Thomas said. "Because even though I don't think I did anything wrong, even though I still believe that the will was influenced and that the system was corrupted against me, I can see that this has become bigger than that, and I won't drag the family through it anymore." "The family is already dragged through it," I said. "I know," Thomas said. And then, after a pause, "Your grandfather knew, didn't he? He knew I would contest the will. He knew I would fight it. And he did it anyway." "Yes," I said. "He was making a point," Thomas said. "Yes," I said again. "The point being that absence has consequences," Thomas said. "That you can't just leave and then expect to have a claim on what was built while you were gone." "That's what the will said," I replied. "That's what the green ink said. You inherit silence. You inherit nothing but the silence of choices made." Thomas didn't respond to that. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. I could hear the weight of 1,000 missed holidays, missed conversations, missed moments that couldn't be recovered or replayed or negotiated away. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm sorry that I left. I'm sorry that I wasn't there. I'm sorry that I tried to undo it by taking money instead of just accepting that I'd already lost something more important a long time ago." "I know," I said. And I did know. But knowing something and being able to forgive it are two completely different things. "The question is," Thomas continued, "what happens now?" And that was the question that nobody wanted to face, because the trial was over. The legal question had been decided, but the family question remained. The question of whether anything could ever be rebuilt, or whether I was just supposed to accept that my relationship with my father had been cremated along with the will that proved his abandonment. Peter told me not to answer that question for a long time. He said that immediate forgiveness would only complicate the narrative that I had carefully built, the narrative of a woman who valued principle over sentiment, who had chosen the legal system over family loyalty. But I was tired of narrative. I was tired of managing how people perceived me. I was tired of treating my father like a hostile party rather than a man who had made terrible choices and who was finally, maybe, beginning to understand the consequences. So I told Thomas, I need time. I need to think about what a relationship between us could look like, and I need to do that without the media and without the lawyers and without the assumption that this is a story with a clear moral lesson. Okay, Thomas said. I'm not forgiving you yet, I told him. But I'm not closing the door either. I'll take that, Thomas said. And then he hung up. The cemetery where Edward and Marjorie Hale are buried is quiet in the late afternoon light. The sun hangs low, tinting the grass an impossible green as shadows stretch long across the stones. 2 months after the trial, I come carrying candles, flowers, and the weight of questions that still don't have answers. The air smells faintly of rain. I kneel before their graves and place 2 white roses, white for silence, green ink for memory. Grandfather, I whisper, I didn't destroy what you built. I opened the door to light like you asked. I held the line even when it cost me. The wind moves through the cemetery, soft and slow, maybe meaningless, but I let myself believe it means something. I'm starting the fund, I continue. The one you imagined, the Hale Stewardship Fund. We'll use it for nursing scholarships, geriatric research, long-term care. For people who show up for the ones they love and shouldn't have to choose between duty and their own dreams. We'll make sure showing up matters. Ruth waits by the gate, quiet, her hands clasped. She came because she had testified, because she'd seen everything and told the truth when it mattered most. When I walk back toward her, I see she's been crying. He was good, she says softly, genuinely good. I'm glad people know that now. The next morning, Peter calls. The Federal Election Commission found irregularities in Thomas's finances, but no fraud. Just rules broken cleverly enough to escape prison. He'll pay fines and face sanctions, while the judge gets a mild reprimand and keeps his seat. It's an unsatisfying justice, but truth, at least, is on record. My grandfather was clear-minded, free in his choices, and Thomas's challenge failed. That isn't nothing. By late June, the Hale Stewardship Fund launches. We hold a ceremony at the hospital where my grandmother spent her last years. The first scholarship bears her name, for nurses in geriatric care who can't afford further study. The second carries my grandfather's, for students in sustainable industries who need help to continue. I speak to the small crowd. Doctors, old colleagues, friends. Money is a tool, I say. We use it to build systems that honor care, that treat presence as strength, not sacrifice. As I finish, I see faces softening, tears glinting. People thinking about their own families, their own choices, where they stood, and what they gave up. For a moment, I feel what my grandfather must have felt when he believed something good could last. A week later, Thomas calls. I saw the press release, he says. It's beautiful. I was wondering if I could contribute. I pause. You can, I answer, on one condition. You give without control or recognition. No naming rights, no seat at the table. You give, and you let go. He hesitates. That's hard. Yes, I tell him. That's the point. You spent your life controlling everything. Me, the narrative, the outcome. This time, you just give. 2 weeks later, he transfers $2 million. No explanation. Just an email. For the future. For people showing up. I've spent months trying to decide what that means: repentance, performance, or something between. Maybe money given freely is its own kind of showing up. Maybe it's the first brick in rebuilding a foundation long broken. Now, the green ink envelope hangs framed in my office beside a photo of my grandparents on their 50th anniversary. It reminds me that truth can be small, handwritten, and indelible. That presence has weight, and absence its own echo. The law, with all its flaws, still bends toward truth, eventually. But families are harder. Reconciliation isn't the same as forgiveness. You can win a case and still lose something essential. I am 31 years old. I have $48 million, my grandfather's company, my grandmother's journals, and a courtroom victory that people will talk about for decades. But I'd trade all of it to know whether my father's remorse is real, whether love can be rebuilt after betrayal, whether forgiveness can live alongside memory. I don't have answers, but I'm learning to live with the questions, to stand in the narrow space between justice and peace, between the silence he inherited and the truth my grandfather wrote in green ink. At sunset, the cemetery is quiet again. The flowers are still fresh. The candles burn low. And somewhere between what was lost and what was saved, between silence and words, there's a possibility. Small, fragile, but alive. Sometimes, possibility is enough.